Hi there, and welcome to today's. Well, this is a bit of a master copy actually. We're looking at the subject of figures in the landscape. So I thought I'd have a go at doing a Seago watercolour, which, as it turns out, was quite an ambitious undertaking. And well, it did give me a few problems, but I think it's probably useful to upload it and show you anyway. As I say, one thing I say in my classes is, every now and again you're going to do paintings which don't work out as well as you might have liked. And that's part of being an artist. The trick is, though, is to try and learn and understand and reflect on what you've done, and then hopefully, it's going to help you sort of become a better artist. I mean, having said that, it wasn't awful, but I wasn't perhaps as happy as I have been with some of the others. But as I say, watercolors is a challenging medium. Anyway, that's a little disclaimer out the way. So here I am putting my initial washes in. Okay, so I really liked this in my painting I did the other week. Um, and the Edward Seago reference there, it's got this very nice transition. It's not even blue. I've learnt in a way, I actually overstated the colour here. The yellow ochre was probably just a little bit strong. So of course, when it dries, it's going to lighten. So I sort of think, well, you could probably push it a bit darker. But if anything, I went a bit too heavy with the yellow ochre. Anyway, so I'm lightening it a bit there. And the blue, his blue at the top of the painting, again, you never know whether it's your picture, the reference photo, but it was probably less blue than that, almost just desaturated grey, which of course is something I'm always saying, to people is to, you have to look at your colours, and often life isn't as saturated in its colour. It's not as bright as you might think. So I sort of fell into that trap a bit here myself. Anyway, so I've laid in my first wash, um, and I'm doing a bit of pulling out here. And that's just because there were some areas in the water where he hadn't gone, used that grey, and it acts like a little highlight in some of the spots. So I'm lifting it out with a tissue, which is something you can always do. It's quite a good idea if you're trying to establish a focal point or a highlight somewhere. So, and I penciled it in very lightly. You can see on the original actually that Seago had penciled his in as well. And it's such a simple little painting. I thought, it'd be good for this. And his figures they work very effectively. So I've allowed it to dry completely here, and I'm looking at my hard edges. And again, with watercolor, trying to think several steps ahead. So this may look dark. This is really just my shadow color. Okay, so I'm thinking of I'll be making several passes, getting darker with each one. So this is really to establish my sort of my first pass with the washers. Those are my lights. Okay, and this here is blocking in the shadows. Um, I think I've got some ultramarine there with a bit of Payne's grey. And again, I probably went a little bit too, a bit bluer than Seago, although it's hard to tell from the reproduction. And the other thing I probably should have done is mix up slightly bigger puddles of colour. So these are all things you can learn from. As I say, now these shadow marks here, this is the shadows cast by the buildings. So they really could have benefited from being just a touch lighter. Okay, so even though they do lighten, they probably still could have been just. But that's, this is the thing, is you can't then go back without getting cauliflowering and all sorts of things. One of the things I'm trying to do in this Seago painting is not simply try to copy the drawing. I'm sort of trying to paint in the way that I imagine Seago would have done, which is economy of means, sort of big brush strokes, and trying to paint quite quickly. So even there, I'm probably being a little bit slow. And part of the reason there is to try and keep these masses tied together, so they're one thing, not lots of little sort of dabby marks. And so looking at the painting as it's finished, this sort of blue wasn't too far off actually. I think looking again at the replay, it looks perhaps a bit dark, but no, it dries quite close to the correct colour. The only thing, I mean, with a watercolour being such a as a medium, you get so much chance effects. You can never really reproduce something, you know, particularly accurately, because really once it's done, it's done. You can't really introduce colours as you go. This sort of range of mountains that he uses as the backdrop um, is really nicely painted in the original. He has this very clever sort of breaking up of the silhouette to create the feeling of distant buildings. So he starts off with the mountain. The top of the mountain is dark, and then as it comes down, it sort of lightens in tone, and he does that with a very nice, I think, probably just introducing more water. But the paint was behaving fairly well here. Trouble with the brush just seems to have got ever so slightly splayed at the end, so the shapes I were making were a bit feathered. Oh, yeah, that was a mistake, as you can see. But like in my other one, it's not the end of the world with these sorts of things. You can adjust, even if it means trying to find ways to sort of disguise it afterwards. I think next week I might be back to the oils. So it was the last of the portrait, Sky Portrait Artist of the Week thing on Sunday. So I did my Mary beard, which I was pleased with. So I thought some watercolours would be a nice sort of change of pace. And this compositionally, this is very much radiating lines. So all the lines bring us into the boat. We've got the big sweeping line of the dock there that comes in towards the boat, and then the perspective on the top buildings. So yeah, and it's a really good example of a a compositional device like radiating lines being really nicely disguised. It's not instantly obvious, but yeah, it's very clever. And again, it's always difficult to know what the scene actually looked like. I think when you go out for a walk, things, you know, how you edit the scene is very important. So they're just suggesting that that's the back mast of the boat. So Seago was a sailor, and he had this boat. I don't know whether that's his boat there, but he would go across from Norfolk and over to France and just all around the Mediterranean painting. Um, Often with he'd have someone on board with him to help prepare his canvases. I always thought it sounded like a great setup. So you can probably see at this point, this is where I was thinking, you know, I was just feeling slightly frustrated because there's a bit of maybe a bit too much water on that foreground. And I think maybe there I was the victim of not, I say, not having pre-mixed my paints. You want a nice, once you've established what your sort of your colours are going to be for these big washes, then it's useful to mix up a bit more of a substantial quantity, because the back and forth and dipping the brush in means that all the sort of ratio of water to pigment will change. There's a story in one of these books about Seago that apparently when he died, he had quite a lot of his work destroyed. And they were saying that because he worked in this very quick, sort of fluid manner, which is one of the things people really like about his work, it meant that there was quite a lot of work that perhaps wasn't quite as successful. So he had that destroyed. And I think it's quite a useful story just to be aware of, say, especially with these watercolours. Having painted this once, it's almost like you need to be painting regularly in order to get that confidence of the brush marks, and that's where I feel that it was letting me down slightly. Just being perhaps a bit tentative. So I've established my mid tones with the blue, and now I'm going in with my darks, trying to establish the drawing. Again, I think on retrospect, maybe I should have gone for a thinner brush at this stage. That was a bit heavy, that line. So just thinking about where this is sort of separating this sort of vertical of the shop streets from the horizontal of the road. Now also, again, that looks very dark, but looking at it now as it's drying, it wasn't too far off, I don't think. I think I wasn't far off actually. The only thing was, I think his blue tone just was a touch lighter underneath that sort of side of buildings there. course, I was hoping to go abroad myself this year. In September, I was meant to be getting married, and unfortunately now with the virus, that's all on hold. Um, and we had been planning on going on a honeymoon and having a cruise. Um, and I thought that would have been a great opportunity to do, well, this sort of thing, bring some watercolour paper and maybe do watercolours if I got a spare break. And But of course, that's the trouble with the coronavirus. Everything's been put on hold now. So, as I say, I think that's where you would really get momentum, is to be out there, with your watercolors, sort of doing this on a almost, you know, few a day. Then it would really start to come to you, I think. It's the shadow side of the boat. Again, that was maybe just a touch dark. And this is one of the things I really like, is the way he handles these boats in the foreground. Again, just very sort of confident mark making. Say, having a boat, one of the things they say about Seago is he really knew the boats, knew how they worked. And of course that does feed into your painting. You sort of you know a bit more, your simplifications are more based on your understanding of them. And this part, he has a very nice, you see there, that little end bit. Um, so he's basically painting sort of an extension of the marina, I think, sticking out into the water. But then maybe at the end there's a boat there, because you get a sort of a mirror, a sort of a little jutting out zigzag, and that suggests reflection. And these lines, this is all about thinking about perspective here, just trying to be aware of where that vanishing point is, trying to get those diagonals to converge. So those foreground objects, they're all starting to help push the our main subject, the boat, sort of back a bit, which is good. One of the sort of functions of the foreground is to create scale, but not be too interesting as to grab our attention. Apart from the mountains, it's not completely unlike some views in Ipswich, because we have a sort of docks um, down here, and you get this sort of large, boats in the water. So Might be interesting to go down there and have a go with this. And those are just suggestions because that part of the painting is all about distance. So I'm looking to create very small shapes so that our eye does travel back. So restating some of these darks, getting some of these windows in. Again, watercolour, it's amazing how simple they can keep the shapes of the windows. You don't need much detail, and in a lot of Seagos you'll see just these little dark shapes. But when they're done well, they really do sort of trick the eye. And this is another thing, these doorways, he uses these negative spaces really effectively. These little dark shadows. So I think at this stage I did start to feel a bit more positive about it. The blue foreground is now about the right. Now we put in the darks of the buildings and the boats. It's starting to function better as our mid value. And I'm just setting up the scene here to put in my figures, which is after all the main sort of reason I've picked this subject. Not quite yet. And that's because I hadn't done that, the perspective wasn't steep enough. So that diagonal, that's a really tricky one. You have to be prepared for that angle to be very steep to get the right feel. Okay, so here we go with our first figure. And as I say, I got my scrap bit of paper out and practiced these a few times. And even then, wasn't completely happy with it. This is this mark. That's the leg coming forward, and you can see that little sort of splayed mark at the bottom there. That's the brush created that, so that's not ideal. That leg should really be just getting thinner there, but such is life. And then head. Remember keeping the head the right ratio. That's really the trick. But he wasn't too bad. Let's stick in a few more here. And if you remember in my video where I talked about this, the heads can all be about the same level. They're about our eye level. So the heads stay constant. It's just the feet where the feet touch the ground, that changes as the figures go away from you. The bodies will be shorter and shorter, indicating some perspective. And getting really small there. Again, all helps to create the illusion of depth and that, you know, there's some people out and about. And what's really nice about this composition is that these people are, relatively speaking, in shadow. So I think that works. They're all within in that sort of bluish tone of the shadow shape. And that's really the sort of thing I'm after. If you do get a chance to have a go this week, is not big figures with much detail. It's just these suggestions of people walking along paths and stuff like that. It really is. It's something that it doesn't come easily at first, but it's definitely worth practicing. And there I'm putting in some little horizontal marks. And all of those combine just to sort of trick the eye and remind us that we're looking at a flat plane there. And Seago, he has the same thing, little sort of side to side marks. It's restating that dark on the boat. What I'm doing with that is I'm surrounding the shadow side that I've already painted with darker tones, and so hopefully just illuminating it ever so slightly. Now putting the masts in. So one of the great things he does with the mast is he has a foreground one and then a background one, and they're almost in perspective as well, but they help to create the feeling of depth. Now, again, Seago's mark making with the boats is just, it's very good. And so I probably went in just a touch too heavy there, and maybe that color tone could have had a bit more sienna in, a bit redder. And then he has this little sideways little sail. Which I guess is the sail having been taken down. Again, there's a mark. And look, this is it, trying to go back. So again, just ends up just a touch heavy and a touch thick. But you know, that's the way it goes, I guess. So in an oil painting, I could get my sky colour and I could just start to cut into that slightly and make it thinner that way. But of course here, once it's on, it's on. So you can always make the line thicker, but you can't really make it thinner. I think what works best actually is the perspective on the road and the building. A lot of that's in the drawing, but and the shadow colour of the blue starts to work, you know. So that's like a lot of times with painting, is you're going to get some parts that work better than others, and you know, and if possible, try and learn from your mistakes. I say that's the other important thing. Um, yeah, just one thing I'm sure most people that paint do this is they try to prop their work up, and then at least you can look at it and reflect on it and think about what went, you know, what was good, what wasn't so good. That's so a really important part of practicing your art, is to be looking at your own artwork over a period of time, really, because that's you're going to be absorbing lessons from it. So here we go a bit darker. So I got the reds out. Seago had this nice effect whereby the shop doors seemed a bit lighter. So I thought adding a touch of red might help to sort of illuminate them slightly, and I think that again I was quite happy with that. I think that worked quite nicely. Now, for those of you watching, I just I did speed it up ever so slightly here because towards the end the marks get more and more sort of pauses between the marks are quite long. So as I say, at this stage it's really just about icing on the cake, trying to make smaller marks, just to try and emphasize the perspective and make some of the details pop out slightly. So although I say I wasn't 100% happy with this painting, there were, yeah, I thought the figures did work well actually, and I'm looking forward to doing an oil painting and perhaps trying something similar. I think watercolor is a great way to practice this with the little figures though, just because trying to think of them more as brush marks I think is a good way, as opposed to sort of spending ages drawing them. There's just a few little lines, just again helping communicate that perspective. And what I was doing there was I was just trying to lift that tone on the shadow side of the boat slightly, just to give a sense of a little bit of reflected light, but I think it was a little bit dried a bit too much there. So again, understanding how the paint's behaving on the paper, that's definitely one of the skills with watercolour. Again, all these marks here just reinforcing the sense of perspective, things being in the distance. So here's the final painting. Okay, so there we are. Figures after Edward Seago. Anyway, so I hope you found something useful about that, and I say that's just a quick demonstration to show you what I've got in mind. So send me yours in tomorrow, and I'll be here on Friday and we can have a look and see what everyone's done. Okay, anyway, thanks a lot for watching. See you soon. Bye.